Americans get a vote, again, the wires will be red hot at the moment, and Washington will be saying, on your side, don't go further yet. In Iran, that'll be interesting. If they want to press a button, the Houthis will now start firing again. The Iranian proxies in Syria and Israel will start firing again. So, like I said, there are choices to be made, and there are people assessing and gaming out. If I do this, what happens next?
In a moment, we're going to hear more, I think, of what is going on in Lebanon with the news of a strike at the city of Beirut. You're listening to Pinar and Friends. I'm John Pinar. It is 6:20, and welcome to the program, Tim Marshall, the analyst, journalist, author on overseas, on foreign news and on security. Welcome to you, Tim.
Hello, John.
Tim, can you add to what is known? What I've said is very, very scant by way of detail, but what do we know? What do you know of what happened in Beirut?
The Israeli Air Force took off about an hour ago, and it's either a drone or it's a missile strike. It was in Daria. This is a Shia stronghold in South Beirut. It's a very, very built-up area, and they've hit a building. It's just off a major roundabout, and I know the city reasonably well. And in that building was a Hezbollah commander. Now, it's possible it was the Hezbollah commander who ordered the missile strike that hit the children on the Golan Heights on Saturday. I personally think they were aiming at an Israeli base and they overshot it because it was an Iranian non-guided missile. The Israelis promised retaliation, and there's been several airstrikes, but nothing of this magnitude.
Right.
And this is bigger because it's actually in Beirut itself. It's exactly where the Hezbollah top commanders are. And it's possible they've even gone after the chief of staff, the Hezbollah military chief of staff. So it is an escalation. Hezbollah now has a choice. Does it climb that escalation ladder, or does it read this, that Israel has not just gone in and smashed everything, it's gone in on a targeted attack, they absorb it, and it doesn't escalate? Because these things that are always calibrated, the Israelis don't want all-out war at the moment with Hezbollah. Depending on what Hezbollah do next, that's where it would be heading.
Right, so how this develops from here, maybe at this point, unknowable. And that's where we watch now. That's what we wait to see now, holding our breath, because there's an awful lot hanging on the answer to that question. We can see, Tim, just as you're speaking there, now some news footage is coming in from Beirut and the size of this strike. It's hard to tell from this picture, but the damage does seem to be quite extensive. It's hard to tell how many people would have been killed by this strike. You say there was a particular target, perhaps in the IDF's sights when it came to this. But as you say, just striking into Beirut, it is daring Hezbollah, if you like, to take this further.
It's a very cold, calculating game, and it's not an exact game calibration. For the last 9 months, they've been firing thousands of missiles at each other. But when you look at what is normally hit, the type of munitions that are used, they're below the threshold which triggers all-out war, as we saw in 2006 between Hezbollah and Israel. The killing of 12 children at the weekend went above that, which is why I think Hezbollah did it. In fact, I have no doubt Hezbollah did it, but I think it was a mistake because that's above the threshold. So Israel now calibrates back, and I know this sounds, callous and cold, but this is how a game is played at that level. And I think that we've seen various strikes over the past few days. That was not the response. I think this is the response.
Right.
This is Israel's response, especially if they've gone after the chief of staff.
Yes.
And so that's why the calibration, Hezbollah reads that. Now, do they read it that this is so bad? Because I suspect there may be civilian casualties. Like I said, I know those streets quite well, and I think it would be very hard to hit a building and not also cause civilian casualties. So they will look at who's been hit. If it's the chief of staff, perhaps the number 2 or 3 in the entire structure of Hezbollah, hard to see them not climbing the escalatory ladder. If it's a regional commander, they might absorb it. So let's wait for those details. Who have they got? What is the scale of the damage? And I think from that we can assess where it goes.
Right. Well, as you say, we wait and we watch. A post has just come up on Twitter from the Minister of Defense of Israel, Yoav Gallant, which simply says this: Hezbollah crossed a red line. And we do know that very soon after that strike on that football field in the Druze area by the border, the Israeli cabinet gave authority to Benjamin Netanyahu and the leadership of the IDF to act and react in the way they felt was appropriate, to whatever degree of severity and with the timing that whatever they chose to deal or to respond to the attack on that area of that Druze area, which is under Israeli protection. And we now see this. But neither side surely will want to see this go where it could go. In the case of Hezbollah, Tim, you've written extensively about that. We're talking about maybe the biggest non-state military force on the planet. They have, is it way over 100,000 men, armed men at their command. They've got 150,000 missiles and rockets, some of them capable of reaching Tel Aviv, maybe enough weapons to overwhelm Israel's Iron Dome defense. Yep. Surely Israel does not want to go there.
Exactly, which is I go back to this word calibration, and that's what the commander meant, the IDF meant when they said they crossed the red line. Nobody knows where these thresholds are. This is why it's an inexact science. I mean, forgive me again for being brutally cold. If it had been a couple of children had died, or it had been a couple of adults, that may fall below a threshold. But when you get that sort of mass casualty, that's above it. So again, I go back to this. If it is the chief of staff, I think this is raising the stakes. You're right to point out not just the 100,000, or I think they probably have less than 100,000 fighters. It's tens of thousands without doubt, and they are very, very battle trained. These guys have been, thousands of them have war experience in Syria for a decade now. But it's the missiles that's the real issue for Israel, because several thousand of Hezbollah's missiles are guided missiles. If they choose to hit a target in Tel Aviv, they will hit it, and they have the firepower to overwhelm Iron Dome, which is why this is such a dangerous game for Israel, because they don't want to spark this all-out war. At some point, both sides think they need to deal with each other, but neither side are ready for that at the moment. But history has always told us that once you start climbing the escalatory ladder, it's very hard to get off it.
Yes. Tim Montgomery and Rachel Cunifer here with us.
Tim, I remember, I think it was after the Brighton bombing when the IRA nearly assassinated our Prime Minister. They said, you have to be lucky all of the time. We only have to be lucky once. And it just feels, that sort of ladder of escalation that you've been describing, how many times are we going to think that we've got away with it because the ladder escalation hasn't been taken? It only takes one time for someone on one side to just have had enough. And the precariousness of this situation just seems to be more and more acute to me at the moment. We've had these scenes in the last 24, 48 hours with the Israeli Defense Forces trying to, arrest renegade officers, and there being resistance to it. In the sort of in the countdown to sort of danger, how worried are you as someone who looks at these events as closely as you do?
It's closer now than it's been since October the 8th. On October the 8th, after the massacres by Hamas in Israel, Hezbollah began to fire the rockets into Israel. They've fired tens of thousands since then. But again, of a type with munitions and the amount of death and destruction which falls below that limit. But we are now at a moment when it could go all out. And there's an added problem. On both sides of that border, in southern Lebanon and in northern Israel, each side has at least 60,000 people out of their homes. So in Israel, there's about 60,000 people that have fled down into the center of Israel, living in hotels, living with families that haven't been able to go back for about 9 months. And it's the same on the other side of the border, 60 to 80,000 Lebanese civilians. And that has to change. The Israeli economy is severely affected by this. So that cannot continue. No country can allow a significant part of its territory and its economy on either side to be in that state. So at some point, that's going to change, either with an agreement between Hezbollah and Israel or with a war between Hezbollah and Israel. And so on the Israeli side, there is that added pressure that we know we may have to do this anyway. And so as they climb that escalatory ladder, thinking we know we have to do this anyway, you could think, let's do it now. There are breaks. The Americans have called for restraint. Britain, well, everybody has. And the Israelis are still fighting in Gaza. If they choose to do it, they can do it. But there are restraining factors. But that, we have reached that moment now where the choices have to be made.
Tim, would you imagine that the Israeli leadership would have consulted with the Biden White House before taking this particular step? If this goes into the ultimate escalation, it's not going to be simply is an inadequate word. It's not simply the IDF against the forces of Hezbollah. It's going to engage other Iranian-backed proxies in other parts of the region, and maybe the wider world too. And you'd think America would be concerned about
like this, John, is that Iran's proxies in Iraq and Syria often use the chaos to open fire on the American troops and bases and allies of the United States there. So the Americans get a vote in this, and they also get a vote in it because on October the 8th, as Hezbollah reacted, not the way Hamas wanted them to react, they wanted to go all out, but Hamas are not ready to burn that bridge yet. The Americans turned around an aircraft carrier. They already had one in the region, in the Med, and they turned around another one round, and they posted them both off Lebanon. And actually, I remember Biden actually said, I've got one word for you, don't. So the Americans get a vote. So yes, I doubt that you would get an American politician and an Israeli politician talking the level of detail. You can go after him, but not him. You can do this, you can't do that. I think it's more at the level of you need to show restraint, act wisely. We accept you need to do something, but calibrate it below. All that sort of conversation. The Americans get a vote. Again, the wires will be red hot at the moment, and Washington will be saying, on your side, don't go further yet. In Iran, that'll be interesting. If they want to press a button, the Houthis will now start firing again. The Iranian proxies in Syria and Israel will start firing again. So, like I said, there are choices to be made, and there are people assessing and gaming out. If I do this, what happens next?
Yeah.
It is probably the most dangerous moment. Certainly for several months. You probably remember Israel and Iran had a tit for tat a couple of months ago. But again, you looked at the calibration of what the Iranians sent and the damage caused. You looked at what the Israelis did to retaliate, and they both said, let's call it a draw. Is that where we're at now? Or is it, no, we're going to keep going?
All right. Tim, it's just so valuable and so fascinating to get your expert take on this at a time like that. Tim Marshall there. Thank you.